All right, welcome everyone to the Tulsa.NET user group. Tonight, Chad Green, an MVP in both Developer Technologies with .NET and Azure, is going to talk about some Azure Functions. This is one of his major technologies that he loves to learn about, play with, and help others learn about. So thank you, Chad, for being here tonight. I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. I really do appreciate it. Sure enough, Azure Functions is something I have really enjoyed since, probably almost since it came out. I mean, it's just, I stumbled upon them. I needed a solution it was funny. I needed a solution to process a file on a nightly basis. And I first did it as a web job, and then that wasn't doing the job right. And then I found the Azure Functions. And that was like 2016, 2017. I've been using them ever since then. So all right, there we go. And it would help if I plug my presenter remote in. There we go. All right. And there we go. Now we should be cooking with bacon. So Sean's already done a great job introducing myself. So for those who haven't met me before, though, I do work for a company called Jasper Engines and Transmissions, which sounds interesting because we're definitely not a technology company, although we are in the middle of building brand new stuff to go to the cloud, and it's been a lot of interesting work. To include, we're using Azure Functions. We're not using the new stuff that I'm going to be talking about today. And I'll talk about why we're not using them yet, but I'm really looking forward to using them. But I have been playing with these for a while. There's all my contact information. Definitely, feel free to reach out if you have any questions about Azure, in particular serverless. That is serverless and event-driven architecture. That is my two key areas, which are actually very related to each other. Couple quick promos. Because I also run a user group that we also stream online. So I'm from Louisville, so I run the Louisville.NET meetup. In July 18th, we're going to have David Giard. He's going to come in and he's going to talk about empowering AI. And then sure enough, this is 2024. You have to have more and more AI talks. So in August, we're going to have another AI talk. This one will get. So David's going to get more, high level and kind of give you ideas of technologies that Microsoft is providing. And then in August, I'm going to give a talk about actually building a generative AI application. And that's actually, it's really great. The Microsoft is trying to get back with the user groups and help us promote our events and give us content and such. And that's actually part of all that. So I'm really looking forward to doing that talk. And then sure enough, I do get around. So I would love for you all to come join me at one of these events. I'll point out two in particular. The one is probably the closest at least for the Tulsa area. Of course, I know not everyone on the call is from Tulsa, but Nebraska Code, that is coming up, 3 weeks, middle of July. So I really enjoy speaking there. I've spoken there for many years. The other one I'll promote, which is actually the two at the bottom, those are co-located events. So API Conference and Serverless Con. And the biggest reason I promote that, if you're going to join me anywhere, that is in Berlin. So that's always a lot of fun. I've only been to Berlin once, but I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to going back. All right. So I'm going to talk about something new that's in Azure Functions, but I know not everyone knows about Azure Functions. As a matter of fact, we were talking about this the last Tulsa.NET meetup, that, a couple of folks are, they have interest in Azure Functions, but really not getting into it. So I thought I would start off with a little bit of a prelude. I'm going to go through these a little bit faster because I think most everyone has, a lot of people have seen the least experience with it. With that being said, my slides will be available afterwards, so you can grab these. But I always like to start with a story of the evolution of application platforms. How did we get to serverless? Why do we have serverless? And sure enough, luckily my blonde hair hides my gray hair very well. But I do remember the days of on-prem. And actually, I'm back to the days on-prem because Jasper is mostly on-prem. We're just starting to do stuff on the cloud. But if you think about what we talked about the on-prem in the world, right? We had to first go get a server, and and of course, usually that was a big purchase and would take forever to go get and everything. And then we had to get the operating system and figure out what version of the operating system and what service packs and all that good stuff. Then you also had to go get your frameworks, your .NET framework, your Java, if you didn't like your life, and I kid with the Java developers. But that was a lot of work. And then, somehow we got our applications built, and by the mercy of God, we got those out on the cloud. And that sometimes was another big ordeal. The problem is we weren't done. There were so many things we had to figure out, right? Lots of questions, like, how are we going to do backups? What are we going to do for security? How are we going to do scaling? All right. What are we going to do for monitoring? Right. And so many other questions that as developers, these are not things that we think about, right? And really, we don't want to think about these things, right? I mean, these are really important questions, right? I mean, any system that has been any amount of users, a lot of these questions, come important, or well, some of these are pure, you definitely need to think about it. I mentioned it to a couple of folks, at the beginning, Jasper, our company was we had a ransomware attack a couple years ago. And our company learned how important it was to make sure we're really secure on everything, right? So, anyways, lots of questions that really didn't have anything to do with our core competency, right? So the cloud comes up, or at least what we call the cloud now. And the cloud really got started with this whole concept of infrastructure as a service. And really, basically, what happened is you had companies like Amazon was really the leader in this, but the idea that, hey, virtual machines have become so much more easier to deal with. We could actually provide that as a service, right? And that was this infrastructure as a service. And and then Microsoft kicked in, everything else, right? So all these companies did all this stuff, and this did make life easier and it made life better. But we still had all the questions. The thing is actually the vendors did a really good job of organizing those questions, especially after a couple of years, once they got a little bit mature in what they were doing. So this definitely made things better. But again, still a lot of things I have to answer, a lot of things I have to deal with on a normal basis. As we move along, we get to platform as a service, and this is where Azure really started to kick off, right? I mean, this is I always talk about the differences between the different clouds, and I've always said the big difference, the differentiator for Azure is the fact that it is more developer focused, and platform as a service was a big reason for that helped with that. And then here, the idea, I'm not dealing with the actual even the virtualized hardware, right? I'm just dealing with a platform. The big one that we normally think about with this is the web, the app service plans with the web apps, right? The whole idea, hey, I have IIS and I just put my stuff up there. I'm not dealing with all the stuff. And it got rid of a lot of questions because there are a lot of things we did not have to deal with now. But what was left to still think about, and really this is an oversimplification of things that had to be thought about, these are really important questions, right? Because what happens when I need to scale up? What if I'm doing, an online store where, we're seasonal, right? Do I run a whole lot of things all the time so I can handle when we need the load? How do I do these scalings, right? Lots of important questions, but again, kind of takes us out of our developer realm. So, then we come more to the serverless idea, right? And get rid of the idea of worrying about the operating system, right? When I'm running serverless as a general form, I don't know what operating system I'm running, right? Now with Azure Functions, I do pick between Windows or Linux, but I don't actually know what version of Windows. I definitely don't know what version of Linux that's running, and I don't care, right? It's not my problem, right? I don't even worry about the framework stuff, right? The vendors take care of that, right? And really, we get rid of all these questions, right? Now, because all those type of things are handled for us, right? We're just now focused on writing the solutions to our problems, right? And usually writing small little pieces of code that handles these type of things. Now, serverless, really, it's kind of a stupid name, right? Because obviously they're still servers, right? And I owe this slide to Jeff Holland because he's the first one I saw do this. But it's not that there isn't servers. It's just that you could think about servers less, all right? And that's really where you can think of the name, right? So I don't have to worry about server configuration. I don't have to worry about server scaling. I just need to worry about getting my application running. Now, when we talk about serverless architecture, there's two different types of architecture in general terms. I'm going to talk about the second one first, which is backend as a service. So this is things like, like SQL Server, right? Which also could be called a database as a server. But SQL Server, right? If you look at Azure SQL, right? Just in itself, forget about the fact there is actually a serverless SKU. But I mean, I don't deal with a lot of things on that, right? I'm just running a service. But then it gets even better when I do run a serverless SKU, and I'm only paying for when it's being used, right? So, another perfect example, Jasper, right? We do not run 24/7, right? We're a remanufacturing company. We're a one shift company, right? So most of our systems run from about 5:30 in the morning until about 5 or 6 in the evening. All right. The rest of the day, they're not in use. Just general, right? I mean, there's a couple of jobs that run at night and so forth. But with that serverless, I don't pay for those servers at night because we're not using them, right? So that's back as a service. We're going to focus more on function as a service, right? And the whole idea here is give me something that lets me, respond to, just like I say, just writing simple pieces of code and respond to them. So that's the function, right? I'm simply adding a function out there. And generally, another way to think of this is trigger-based development, right? Because function as a service generally is responding to some type of trigger. So as I was mentioning, normally we call them event-driven. Like I said, I really need to change the slide and say trigger-driven because I think that's a better way of describing it. But the point is something happens and it triggers a piece of code to run. And that something could be something from an HTTP trigger to to a message being put on a service bus or event hub, a text message coming in, all kinds of things we can do with that. These are short-lived, right? And generally, when we talk about short-lived, I mean, hundreds of milliseconds, right? And maybe a couple seconds. Generally, it's not to say they only have to be that long, but generally, we're talking about something that's short-lived. Lives for the moment that's running and is gone. It doesn't keep state; it just keeps on going. One of the great parts is the automatic scaling. Right. The idea that I do not worry about scaling. So when all of a sudden my service starts getting a lot of hits, the serverless service will say, hey, we need to add some more servers to handle those needs, right? But even better, when I stop, when my usage goes down, it'll scale down all the way to zero, depending on the service, right? And that's how that saves me money, right? Because it's saving the vendor money, so it saves me money. And then we generally pay per execution. Now, there are some exceptions to this, and we'll see this when I get a little more deeper into Azure Functions. But as a general rate, or a general rule, functional service, you're paying for each execution of this, and so which can make it a lot cheaper. And then finally, we have that abstraction infrastructure. I'm not worried about what it looks like. All I know is that again, I have this piece of code that I put out there, I deploy, and it runs. All right, so that's the real quick, just in a couple of minutes, function as a service. If we want to look at Azure Service, right now, sure enough, Azure has a lot of things that fall into the service bucket. Right now, I will say some of these are because Azure Marketing says they fall in the service bucket, and some of these are really truly serverless. And let's get an idea of what we're talking about here. First is the compute, and really, I like to highlight the two on the right. So the Azure Container Apps and Azure Functions, right? So Azure Functions is by true definition serverless, right? I mean, that's its whole idea. The Azure Container Apps, I loved when I first heard about Azure Container Apps. So as an MVP, we get the opportunity to attend what they call these product group interactions, and which is the product group, the Microsoft product group's opportunities to meet with us online and show us what they're working on. And I attended a call, this was several years ago, and they're like, hey, Kubernetes, it's great, except for it's really hard to get set up and hard to keep it up and running. we're creating up this Azure container apps, right? And of course, my first thought was it's serverless containers, right? And that's truly what it is, right? And it's really, really great the way how that works. And then, you know, the other two, Microsoft, if you look some of the web pages, they list these as serverless. I can question that, but we'll keep it in there for now. Some other, when we look at workflow and integration, right? So your logic apps, the idea of, hey, I need to, have a workflow. Logic apps are great. I don't use them very often, but they're great for your power users, right? Because it is a graphical way of building a workflow and having it trigger, different things to happen. Your API management, which is a little bit of a beast, but it's great for manage your APIs, hence the name. Microsoft is great with naming because you can pretty much figure out most everything what it is just by its name, right? And you don't really have to think about it too much. And then you have your event grid. Event grid is basically your glue to everything, right? Something happens on one other system, I need another system to know about it. That's basically the easiest way to think about event grid. We move into the data processing analytics. You see event hubs, the whole idea of processing a lot of events, quickly. Stream analytics, I want to do real-time analytics on things. I've used a system once where I was working for an education company, and we on average would have 20,000 current users at any point in the day, and we were always trying to figure out what all they were doing. We were using stream analytics to go through data records and do real-time, not just real-time reporting, but real-time grading, because they were taking practice tests and so forth. So lots of interesting things there. Your messaging, you'll see event hubs again, but your service bus, your event grid, which actually is there again, but some great ways to handle messaging, doing those event-driven type architectures and so forth. And then finally, we got the data storage, and I mentioned Azure SQL. Cosmos is the same way. Cosmos a little bit more so than Azure SQL because it is truly because you really have no idea what it's running behind. It's pretty interesting what they're running behind, but it's again with Cosmos it is just set up my database and let it run, do a couple settings. But they also have that serverless or that consumption base. I only pay for when it's actually in use, and that's great. All right, but let's talk about Azure Functions, right? And that's all we're going to really talk about for the rest of the night. And the idea of Azure Functions, the whole idea of taking your code and putting it together with your events and data, right? And then putting those together, right? And that's kind of how they came up with this logo, right? The idea of handling it. So what are some of the big features, just overall when we talk about Azure Functions? Well, first off, you have your choice of language. So you got the obvious, C# and JavaScript and F#. But Azure Functions, supports Java and TypeScript and Python and Bash. And one of the cool things that it's been kind of funny if you look at Azure Functions over the years, right? They've supported these languages for a long time, but not everything was supported, right? Well, actually, that was one of the big goals of last year, the year before, of getting that parity, right? And actually making sure that what you could do with one language, you could do with all the others, right? And in the C# world, we have benefited from also, right? It's if you look at the whole isolated model, which I'm not going to talk too much about the isolated model tonight, but right, the function team was forced to bring C# in the isolated mode because of .NET 5, and I'm so glad they did because it is definitely a much better model. But going back to the other big features, bring your own dependencies, right? So have your packages in NuGet, get your npm if you're doing the JavaScript type stuff. And sure enough, quick little best practice. I usually tell everyone pretty much write most of your code in a DLL. If you're doing the C# world, write your code in the DLL, and your Azure Functions really just calls in a DLL. And the reason why I talk a lot about that is because it's not a really good way to actually unit test your Azure function, but you can, much easier unit test a class library, right? But then, sure enough, there's a lot of competitors to Azure Functions, but I really love how well they do the integration, right? So whether, I need to respond because something happened with data in the Cosmos database. I got an Event Hub message. I got event grids, service bus messages coming in. Notification Hub is still around. I've had these slides for a while, but these kind of things, or even just something happens in my Azure storage. Really easy to create functions that respond to these type triggers or bind to these triggers and easily add data to these or send off messages and so forth. But the great part is these make sense, right? Because these are all Microsoft services. But Azure Functions is not just about Microsoft stuff, right? RabbitMQ, GitHub. Yeah, GitHub is owned by Microsoft, but it's still a separate company, right? Twilio, right? So these other things. Plus, they've also made it very easy to write custom triggers and bindings, right? So if you really need something, it's not that hard to write. I actually, it's been a while, but I actually one time did need a custom trigger to handle some IoT equipment, and that's what we did. So interesting things we've done there. You got your flexible development. You can write stuff in the portal. You can do it all there. You're going to have better luck, using something like Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. But you also, there's the CLI that works really, really well. And as a matter of fact, when we do local development, we're using the Azure Function CLI type thing. But also, Azure DevOps, GitHub, Maven. But also along with that, OneDrive, Bitbucket, and all these other types of repositories, they made it very easy to connect to all these things. And then you get the hosting options. And this is really one of the, our key point for tonight are the hosting options, right? So real quickly, you got your consumption, right? And again, this is your true serverless, right? The whole idea that, I'm only paying for when it's in use. When it's not in use, it will scale all the way down to zero, but it also will scale up. And on the consumption model, potentially it will scale up to 100 servers. Hello. If that is what is needed. Yeah, next. Yes. Gino, are you trying to ask a question? I guess not. Okay. Now. Yeah, because I could have swore I heard my name. That's the reason why I was asking that. But all right. So you got your premium, right? Which I've labeled sort of serverless. And the reason why I say sort of serverless, it is serverless in the sense that it's got all the scaling and all that type of stuff. In premium, the easiest way to, one of the big differences here is that it scales down to one, right? It's the idea that you will always have at least one instance running, right? So it never fully goes to sleep. And there's some reasons to do this. It's a big thing for cold starts, right? So we don't have to worry about those. And I'll talk more about cold starts in a moment, if you haven't heard that term. But so you have that. But also on premium, you're running, better memory and better CPUs and that type of thing. Hence the name premium. A couple other models, you've got the dedicated, so you can run this in an app service plan and run, of course there you handle your own scaling, right? And then container apps. And I have not played with the container apps on Azure Functions. But I do find it very interesting, and we are using a lot of container apps. And like I said, we're in the middle of migrating stuff from we're not going to migrate everything, but we are migrating things from on-prem to the cloud. So I foresee container app function. I am using container apps, but I'm not doing it for the function apps. I do see that in my future. But then plenty other options you have here, right? You got the Azure stack. You can run it in your own server. Right, there's no restrictions right on that. Right, I can download the runtime and run it. And sure enough, when I'm doing local development, that's what I'm doing. Right, I'm actually running on an actual copy. I'm not running an emulator. I'm actually running Azure Functions when I do that. And and there's a whole IoT type advantage. And then the final big benefit I like talking about is that it is open source. Right. And there's a couple of reasons why this is great. Right. Number one, sure enough, you can see how was it done, right? You also could say, hey, I don't like this. I bet I could do this better, and and try to do it better, right? These are great things to do this. Now, I will say this: you're not necessarily going to see exactly what Microsoft's working on right that moment, because Microsoft does put, they will create, they'll fork it out, do their private repos, and then check it back in, right? So I'm about to talk about a new hosting model And I can tell you, they've been working on a whole lot longer than what they've been publicly talking about. All right. So like I say, lots of great benefits. But again, one of the big things is all these options for hosting options, right? But what's awesome about this is we have a new hosting option called Flex Consumption. And I first heard about Flex Consumption last year at the MVP Summit. And I have been really excited about this. And it's funny because where I'm at right now at Jasper, I'm even more excited because there's some big things that make Flex Consumption very enticing for us. Now, before I get into details about Flex Consumption, I thought I'd talk about Project Legion real quick. And I'm going to go through this really quickly because I only have a little bit of knowledge about Project Legion. And really, honestly, my slides are based on the it's not even really a white paper, but the introductory page that talks about Project Legion. But, basically what it boiled down to is, Microsoft said, hey, we're needing better services to handle our needs, right? We need this ability to be able to go from 0 to thousands of instances. And, we need a better way of doing that. And that's kind of the heart of Project Legion. So you can see this, right? I mean, here's their design principles. I mean, there's some pretty lofty things in here, right? Again, that being able to burst to thousands of instances, not hundreds, but thousands of instances. The parity with the Kubernetes pod API specifications, operating at a growing scale, right? Lots of big things that really make a difference, right? And so kind of how this works, I mean, they're using other Azure services, right? So they're using Cosmos, they're using ASE, they're using these nested virtualized VMSs, right? But then they've added some of their own APIs, right? And if you look at what these are doing, right, the Kubernetes and the pull groups, right? Basically saying, hey, the industry's done some great work, but let's make it even better for our stuff, right? So we can actually even excel even better. Because of this, we're seeing great benefits, right? Startup boost for functions, which is a big deal, right? It's sure enough, Microsoft's biggest problem they've had against Lambda has been startup, and it's great to see. I mean, that problem is getting less and less, right? The disparity there is getting less and less. But also, there's overprovisioning of CPU, which I find funny because I've always joked about how quickly Azure Functions, scales up, and you're going to see now it's insane how quickly they will scale up. So some great things that they're doing. As far as in action, so container apps was one of the first things that we saw with this, where they needed to be able to do some more things, with the container apps. We're seeing it now in the Azure Functions with that Flex Consumption. But also, again, this is 2024. You got to talk about AI, right? So Azure Container Apps has this dynamic sessions, which basically is a way to run, what's the word I'm looking for? Basically, the unsafe type, coding, right? And this is apparently part of what's running Code PaLOUsa, right? So Project Legion, apparently has some tie-ins back to Code PaLOUsa, which is pretty important. All right, let's get to Flex Consumption. Let's the whole star of tonight. Now, and I will say this right now, it is in public preview right now. So, and I want to state that clearly, right? So, big thing with that, if you go put it in production and you start having problems, not to say that Microsoft's going to say tough luck, but they're also going to say, hey, that is preview, right? We can't actually guarantee anything in a production environment. And I'm not saying don't use it in production. I'm just saying, be cautious. Be cautious with that. And there's still some things that are not there yet. And we'll talk about that. With that being said, I was a member of the private preview. I've been playing with this for a while. This is really fleshed out, right? And they've done a really good job of getting this built. So what are the things that Flex Consumption is addressing? Well, first off, like I said, one of the biggest issues that we have in serverless, and this is not just Azure Functions, right? This is serverless in general, is this cold start, right? And this isn't even just, functions and Lambda. I mean, even like, I talked about the Azure SQL, right? I use serverless in that, and even that has cold start issues, you have to deal with. And this has been an issue. This is part of an issue we have in the serverless world. And if we look at how, oh, I should say, so the whole idea of a cold start, again, scales down to 0. So now when you get the next call you get, the Azure needs to spin up that instance back up. And sure enough, behind the scenes, they're using containers, right? So they just scale up that containers. And that's an oversimplification, but they're using those containers. And in the .NET world, that spin up could take 2 seconds, could take 4 seconds, it could take 40 seconds, right? And again, there's a lot of variability in that because there's a lot of, it depends, right? It depends on, what packages did you put in your Azure function? How much are you doing on startup? Are you doing a lot of loading of settings and that type of stuff? That will slow it down. But, so these are the kind of things we deal with this, right? So, what has Microsoft done so far? Well, in premium functions, you have the always ready concept. Like I said, premium does not scale down to 0. It scales down to at least 1. Right? Again, you can say, hey, actually, I want you to scale to 5 or what have you, right? But so it has that concept. In consumption functions, basically you wait, right? Now, with that being said, one little trick that I have done in the past, and this sometimes works, you can actually create an Azure function that's run a timer trigger, and then call your other Azure function you want to keep awake. And that sometimes works. It doesn't work 100% of the time, but it does work pretty well. And for a low usage Azure function that you still need to respond quickly when it does go to sleep, that can be a way of getting around that. But with flex consumption, we now have the optional always ready. So premium, you always have always ready. You always go to at least 1. In flex consumption, we have this option, right? Again, the whole idea of flex, right? I need this option. So, to get an idea what this looks like, on this image, we've got set up to have 2 always ready instances. So anytime a request comes in, if there hasn't been a previous request in approximately 20 minutes, no problem, right? Because you have something that is ready to take that call, right? And then you can see the load picked up, right? And so so they started on-demand instances, and then as the load went back down, scale those back down. And sure enough, I will say it's not like it continues to run the always ready. The moment that it gets a call, it does it does create that on-demand instance, ready to take on your needs. So that's a great feature. I mean, again, this idea that I can this is optional, so I can turn this on and off if I need to. Now I will say, because I have been asked this, there's not a way to, at least in the portal, there's not a way to go and schedule, say, hey, I want to, because I've been asked this, well, can I make it always ready from like 5 a.m. to say 5 p.m., right? And I'm like, well, not through the portal, but I mean, you could automate that, right? So that is one way you could do that. Next big feature is the virtual network support. So sure enough, in Azure Functions today, what's generally available, in the consumption model, virtual network support is now supported, right? Or that was a double, but yeah, point being, you can't do VNet in a consumption-based. You have to go to the premium model. And, sure enough, the premium model does have a premium cost, right? Especially when you're in a more sporadic type instance. So this is one of the big reasons why I'm really looking forward to this. Like I say, we're a hybrid shop. So we do have Azure functions that are calling back into our on-prem data center. So I need this VNet support. So I'm really looking forward to being able to use this. And again, when we talk about virtual network support, we're talking about what you would think of, right? The idea, being able to have those inbound connections, doing the integrations and so forth. And there's no extra support for no extra cost for the support, right? I mean, you're obviously going to pay for the VNet resources, right? I mean, that obviously there's a cost there, which is actually pretty minor. But there's no cost for the Azure function to use this, right? And this is a great feature here. Some other big things, and again, a lot of this is kind of mixing, consumption and premium, right? The instance memory choice, right? Again, this is something we have in premium functions now, but in the consumption model, you're charged, based upon what you actually use. Here, you actually specify this, right? So as of today, I can specify basically 2 gigabytes or 4 gigabytes of memory. More options are coming. Really interesting, and maybe afterwards Paul can describe this what happened here. But during the private preview, there was 512. And sure enough, in a bunch of the documentation, it still says 512. I think that, I assume we'll see that come back here soon, but they are saying we'll get more options, right? But the idea here is, specifying how much memory that I'm allocating to each instance that is running my Azure function. The default is 2048, and from everything I've seen, that default is going to make sense for most everyone, right? Going up to 4096 means that you're doing something a little bit more on the exception, but you have that capability, right? And that's great. You can change your memory instance size anytime. It's you can do it in the portal. You can actually, I normally do it through the CLI, and it's very easy to do that. And the big thing to think about, more memory means more can be done, right? And I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? Think about being able to run more, more function execution within an instance, right? Or being able to run a bigger Azure function that is doing more things with that, right? So that's what we're talking about here. Next feature we have is this per instance concurrency. And this is actually really cool. And at first I was kind of like, I don't know if I would ever really fool with this. And I still pretty much tell everyone, you're probably not going to fool with this too much. But the idea here, how many instances or how many executions am I going to have on each instance of my app? And sure enough, if you're new to Azure Functions, a big concept to understand is you have a function app, which consists of one or more functions, right? And so when I talk about so the instance is an instance of the function app, and then your functions running in that instance, right? And basically, this is, like I say, it's defining how many parallel executions you can get, right? You can set, and you're able to set this per instance, right? And this has that direct effect on how your app scales. So, and again, I did steal a lot of images from the documentation because, Microsoft has done a really good job of this. So here, we kind of see what we're talking about here. So in this first instance, we get 10 requests came in, and I set the concurrency to 1. So I said, every time that I get a request, I want you to create a new instance, right? And you might think, boy, that sounds crazy. I actually have had that need before, right? And for reasons. But so we can see what that does. And it started up 10 instances, right? On the second drawing here, we've got 10 requests come in. We have a concurrency of 2, so 5 instances have ran. So the big thing to think about here, there's a couple things. I mean, number one, you got performance, you've got, some things that, similar to that, but also you have cost management that goes in here, right? So those 10 requests coming in, if our default size is 2048 megabytes, I'm paying, for, 10 times 2048 times, the number of seconds I'm running, right? So that's the thing to think about that. Whereas in the other one, again, 2048 per instance, but I'm only paying for 5 of those instances, right? So that's one of the things to think about with concurrency, right, with this. Now, Microsoft has already figured out, the defaults to figure this, to run with this. Now, I will say, if you're doing Python, the default is 1. And I have forgotten the reason why. I don't do Python development, so I don't worry about that too much. But with Python, your default is 1 concurrent, so it is going to be 1 for 1. On your other languages, you'll notice a trend here. So 512 is 4 megabytes, 4 instances, or sorry, 4 executions. 2048 is 16, 4096 is 32, right? So basically, what Microsoft has pretty much figured out is you can run, each instance probably is running 128 megabytes is the math that they're doing, right? So again, some really interesting things to do. Most likely you're not going to fool with these numbers, but you could. The next big thing, the per function scaling. And this is one of the things when I heard about this, last year, I got really excited, right? Again, having a better way of figuring out how to scale my Azure function. So one of the best practices, and I'm still going to follow those best practices for a while, is, don't mix your triggers, right? And the reason, so in other words, don't have like an HTTP trigger and a service bus trigger in the same function app. And one of the reasons why, I've always said that is, they don't scale the same way, right? And so, but here we now have this option, right? Because I actually can define how it scales, right? Great part is no code changes. This is all configuration, right? There are a couple special cases. So your HTTP, your blobs, and your durable triggers, those have to scale together, right? And the way how it's built. With that being said, that pretty much makes sense, especially your durable triggers. You probably want your orchestrator and your activities to be scaling up together. So that makes a whole lot of sense. So again, to see this visually, what we're talking about, here we can see we have a function app. It's got 8 functions, right? The first 2 functions are HTTP triggers, so those will scale together. You've got your durable function. I drew a blank there for a second. What is this? You got your durable function that will scale together. But you see these other 3, right? Your service bus and your event hubs. You have the options to set this up to so that they scale on their own, right? Again, things that Microsoft is handling mostly for you. You don't really need to worry about it, but you have these options, and that's what I really like is giving us options to do things that because sometimes we need to tune the performance even better. The next big thing, and this is part of the whole reason for the name of the session, right? This scale out further. So by default, with I can scale up to 100 instances. So if I get enough traffic coming in, Azure Functions by default, without making any changes, will scale up that up to 100 instances, right? There's actually options to go up to 1,000. Now, there's a bit of a restriction with that, because within a region, within a subscription and a region, you can only run 512 megabytes of memory on your Azure Functions in total. So if you're running 2048, you can't run 1,000 2048 instances. You can run 250, right? But I could run it could run 1,512 megabyte instances. That's the way to think about it. But that sounds like a restriction. But here's the thing: the default is 100 max instances. If I remember correctly, consumption, that is the max they can ever go to, is 100 instances, right? And I forget what premium is. It might also be 100. I've drawn a blank off the top of my head. But so even though it's really 250 when we talk about the 2048 limit, that's still a whole lot of instances. And again, these are it's not like it's only being able to hit 250 executions, right? Because you're running more than one execution per instance, right? So this allows us to run a lot of stuff in here. All right. Interesting, I put this in here. The lowest you can go to, the lowest max you can have is 40. Reason why I brought this up is I actually I found a way with consumption to actually have it so it would never scale more than 1. That sounds like crazy talk, right? Because that's not what you would normally want to do with an Azure function. But I actually had a need that I could only have something scale up to 1. I needed it, and long story short, I needed a queue trigger. I made a whole list to do a queue trigger. The company didn't want to pay for the database to be able to support a whole bunch of instances coming in, and so we did 1 instance, right? And it just took longer to run everything, right? And again, I've already talked about this 512 megabytes, and again, per region, per subscription limitation. But so what does this mean, right? The fact that I can scale out further. Well, again, grabbing some images from Microsoft. This is, a test that they did with GitHub, and they sustained nearly 1.6 million transactions per second, right? Or executions, I should really say, with 1 function consumption app, right? Our flex consumption app. That's pretty darn cool, right? This is something most of us are not going to ever need to create 1.6 million sustained events per second, right? GitHub would have needs for that, right? So this is pretty good to know that, we're going to be pretty good with this. So some other big benefits you get with consumption apps. I have not had a chance to play with this. I didn't even notice. I don't know if I just didn't notice it or it got announced even privately right before they went to public or to the public preview. But they've added in load testing integration, and sure enough, and we'll see it because I'll go to the portal here in a couple minutes. You'll see there's actually a new menu item for load testing, and so the idea do your load testing here. One of the things that they're working on is actually being able to run load test to figure out the right settings. So all these things we've been talking about, the concurrencies and the amount of memory per instance, all that kind of stuff. Supposedly what we're going to be able to do is actually run load test, say, hey, this is what I expect my Azure function to be able to handle. And then they'll say, okay, well, here's what you should tweak this to. And again, I have not seen this. I've only read about this. And I haven't seen it just because I have not had a chance to play with it yet. But really anxious to play with that. We have the open telemetry opt-in or capabilities, and then you have your whole long execution time. So again, I talked about functions in general. Your function as a service is generally short running, but there are times we need a really long running execution time. And with flex consumption, there is no actual limit, right? So on a consumption base, by default, an Azure function cannot run longer than 5 minutes. You can only ever make it up to 10 minutes. Right here, you can get this. So lots of great benefits. But there's one more benefit I didn't talk about, and that is pricing. And I think pricing is really important to talk about when we talk about flex consumption, right? And this was the part I was worried about. So sure enough, when I did attend that briefing, over a year ago, the team did not know what the price was going to be, and I was really scared about this. Right, I was like, oh, because there's some really great features in here, right? Plus, we didn't talk about how much faster it is on scaling up, and just how much faster the services seem to be running, right? So, what does the pricing look like? Well, so first off, you're still going to have your on-demand pricing. This is very much the way how consumption works. As a matter of fact, the pricing is very, very similar. And then you're going to have your always ready, which again is optional. So you do not have to use always ready. So it is a completely optional area. So here's the pricing. Now in the US, I don't know, we might have people outside the US. Obviously, it's going to be different pricing there. But the actual price, the dollar amounts for the first two items, your on demand, that is the same as the consumption app, right? What's different is the free grants, right? So on a regular consumption app, I get 400,000 gigabyte seconds for free and 1 million executions for free. So here, basically, I cut down and forth. But my thinking with that is, and again, I'm going to show you what this means in an actual price difference. That extra little bit of cost is well worth it for all the benefits I'm getting out of this, right? And for the speed and the scalability that I'm getting out of this. And then we get an idea of what that's always ready. Of course, there's so many zeros in that number. It's really kind of hard to get an idea of what this runs. But we can we've got some slides to show this, right? And I will say, and this is interesting because I'm not sure if Paul's still on the call, but Paul might be able to correct me on some of these because the calculator does not do these calculations. So I had to figure out these calculations myself. So we'll see if I got them right. But here's my standard scenario, which actually, I guess I took this from Microsoft because I saw it's on their pricing page. I've been using this scenario for so long, I couldn't even remember where I got it. But the idea, running 3 million executions per month, each execution, I still kept with the 512, even though right now in the private preview, 512 is not available. But I kept it just to be consistent, but then and running for a second. So on consumption model, that will cost you $18, right? And I realized I meant to take that slide out. Same thing I was already saying, just different form of the slide. So In consumption model, that will cost you $18, right? So really, really good price to be able to do 3 million executions, right? That's a lot of executions, right? That's a lot of stuff going on every month, right? And the funny thing is, this is considered to be sporadic, right? You know, even though for a lot of people, 3 million executions in a month, that's a lot of things going on. On the premium, to do the same thing, you're looking at $155.27. Now, again, remember that you've got an instance that never goes to sleep. You've got faster CPUs. You've got more memory. So there's some other benefits you're getting with this, right? But that's where the cost is. So if I've got my numbers right, flex consumption without always ready, right? $20.60. So sure enough, it will cost me $2.60 more than the regular consumption. But I get this, this extreme scalability, I get the faster startup times and so forth. To me, that is probably worth the $2.60. And it's going to be more worth than some more examples I have here. All right. So what about the always ready? Here's where I'm still a little bit guessing on these numbers. I'm still trying to figure out a little bit of these numbers. But I said, 1% of executions are performed while idle. And so here your cost goes to $33.70. So sure enough, I mean, you've got your always ready cost that you're paying for the whole time that always ready is enabled. And that is for a whole month, right? So, and that's using the 730, which Microsoft likes using to figure out a month, right? So, to me, that's amazing, right? To know that I probably won't have a cold start issue, right? And I'm going to have things that will scale up a whole lot quicker. And all the other benefits here, that is definitely worth that cost, right? When I need always ready, right? Again, it's an optional thing. But let me show you, what I think is an actual scenario, right? And again, we haven't deployed this yet. We're still in development. We're supposed to deploy next month. We're now looking August, but I have a rough estimate for this one process that we're going to need. It's going to do about 434,000 executions per month, right? Because it's a monthly sync process, right? So it's going to run once a month. It's going to do what it needs to do, right? And here I am using 2048 memory because that's probably, that will make more sense on this one. Running for 400 milliseconds because that's about what we're seeing in development right now. And like I said, we need VNet connectivity. It's actually connecting because it's actually taking data that we've got in a SQL database. It's taking data we've got in a Cosmos database. It's comparing the data that we're getting from another source, and it's also writing back to a SQL database. Well, actually, both a SQL database and an Oracle database back on-prem, right? So, what would this? And here we're not going to need always ready. Like I said, it's a monthly process. It runs once a month. If it takes 20 seconds to start up, which it won't take 20 seconds, but even if it takes 5 or 6 seconds to start, not a problem here, right? So we don't need always ready. So consumption, I can't do it because of that VNet, right? I need that VNet connectivity, and so it's not an option. On the premium, $155, right? To run that out. And again, I'm using a little bit of simple numbers. You can have multiple function apps run on one instance and all that kind of stuff. But for simplicity, here's what we're talking about. So flex consumption, if I got my math right, $4.16. Now, and I will say that assumes that I'm not running any other Azure functions, which we will be, because that's using the whole monthly grant, right? So the 100,000 gigabyte seconds and the 250,000 executions. So we're going above that number, but that's where the cost comes up. And I will say, so sure enough, we are an employee-owned company, and so our stock prices are, we get stock issued to us based upon how well the company does and how much we can save the company. I love the fact that I'll be able to save a company like essentially $150 a month, and have a really good, amazing service, right? I mean, that's what's great. All right, so I've been talking about this. Let's see this in action. So, All right. So Sean, can you confirm I'm still sharing the right screen? You see
Yeah,
a
you're on
resource
the Azure
group?
portal,
Okay, great. So,
resource visualizer.
yep, great. Of course, there we go. Get the Zoom controls out of my way. All right. So I've got this resource group created. Here we can see, we've got our Azure function over here, with all its resources. If you've never looked deeply, there's several things that, Azure needs or Azure Functions needs. But the important part is it's actually connecting to a VNet to send messages to this event hub. All right. And, so that's well, the other things you're seeing in here, right? The private network in there so that, so we can secure this event hub. And this is not an unusual scenario, right? The idea that I want to have some extra security on these important resources, but have this HTTP endpoint that can get data in there, right? And I will say, this demo, I mean, it's not on my repo because actually, but on my repo, I have a link to where this demo came up from. Someone on the Azure, I think it's someone on the Azure Function team. I know someone at Microsoft wrote this sample. But so we can see this, what we're going to be running, and let it be known, I mean, this is not your everyday event hub namespace. So it is just standard, right? Which actually isn't the lowest tier. The lowest tier is basic. The standard is your pretty much your everyday event hub instance. But we're running 40 of these things, right? So this is a pretty beefy one. So I do, I literally created this right before the meetup, and I will delete this right after the meetup, right? So I'm not keep on paying for all this. But here's the Azure function, right? And really, there's nothing you're going to see different here, right? Except for you'll notice plan type says flex consumption because, because it is, right? And here you can see we've got it set to 2048. So, we've got all these settings up here, and we've got this process customer feedback. So in this scenario, we're going to send a whole bunch of feedbacks, customer feedback. And like I said, it's going to get posted into that event hub. So we've got our live metrics up here. I'm going to double screen this so we can see this here. Let me go ahead and start this while I keep on talking because it will take, oh, hold on, I gotta click one more on here because this will take a moment to get this started. But so check this out. At the moment, we're scaled down all the way to 0. So I don't have any always ready, right? And sure enough, that might make sense to turn always ready. But in this example, because we want to show just how quickly this runs, right? Which also shows how quickly Microsoft has improved the cold start. Once this actually gets started, yeah, which it is running, right? There we go. Well, it'll still be, it was over just a little bit. So it's still provisioning. So this is my stalling for a moment. Because it takes a moment for this to start. Really hard. So I actually gave this presentation Friday, and I only had a 40-minute time slot. So this was fun when I had to just talk around a thing. But I need to talk around because I want you to notice this number here, right? Because again, you're going to see this go from 0. And it's going to scale up really, really quickly. And I'm trying not to give away the number it's going to just explode up to.
Azure knows when you're doing a demo.
Right. Yeah. Well, no. All right. It's executing. So we should start seeing this number change here. We'll start seeing the requests come in. Still another moment here. Again, the fun part. I thought about recording this, so I could get through this quicker. There we go. Look, it went from 0 to 30. I mean, you want to talk about insanity. That is crazy talk, right? The fact of how quickly that just jumped up. Notice we're hitting over 4,000 transactions per second, right? I mean, it's just handling it like a champ. And I don't know, it's a little bit hard to see what the actual cold start was on here, but it wasn't long, right? Because I mean, even even from the time that we see in this window saying executing to the time we saw an execution, that was only a second or two, right? And some of that is just actually load test, actually starting to send the request over. So sure enough, this will run for a minute, and it'll send approximately 605,000 requests. And, and Azure Functions just handles this like a champ. And sure enough, and notice it's already scaling down. It's already, oh, I don't need that. All right. I mean, it's already readjusting itself. The other cool part, not just how quickly it scales up, also cool how quickly it scales down. All right. And while that doesn't really matter to us as far as the execution of our application, there's some other things that we should think about. Oh, now it's scaled up to 35. Because one, obviously, every time, this costs Microsoft money, right? So the fact that they're scaling down is great because that means, I'm gonna grant you, Microsoft was worth $3 trillion. So they're, they can handle a little bit extra money, but at the same rate, if this service costs more for them to run, it costs more for, they're going to charge us more. So there's that. But then there's also the whole, ecological, concerns, right? Obviously, if they can scale these down quicker, means less, energy use and so forth. So again, just really cool. I really love seeing how this works. And like I say, we'll keep this up and running here, and we can see that it will scale down pretty quickly. So the other demo, I'm going to actually, instead of going to the console, I'm just going to show my little cheat sheet here, just because you really don't want to watch me typing. And I could copy and paste, but really I just want to get to the point of showing off some things. So in here, I just want to show, that some things didn't change, right? Or only changed a little bit. So we can see if we're going to create a project, so here we can use the function CLI, right? So I can initialize my project, navigate to the project, create a new function, create an HTTP trigger, add my code into here, right? So none of this changes. This is not a single change whatsoever in here. Oh, there we go. We see the request to stop. We should see the number of servers go down here pretty shortly. Not going to go down to 0 right away because obviously maybe another spike will come in. But so here we start seeing creating this. Now, first thing, and I haven't talked about this yet. Again, this is in preview. It is not available in every region yet, right? I'm assuming it will be. Not necessarily during a preview, right? But at some point, I'm assuming it will be, right? Because I don't see a reason why it wouldn't be. But right now, it's like about a dozen regions. And so, sure enough, the recommendation is, hey, go make sure the region you want to put it in, you can, right? So that's what this is doing. I will show that list here in a moment. So you get that. So then, then everything else is this, a couple of same steps, right? Create my resource group, create a storage account. So again, if you're new to Azure Function, Azure Function uses the storage account for several things. The big thing is to actually store the code that it's running, right? But there's other things that part of how it does its magic is actually in that storage account. So you create that, then you're going to create your function app. And the only thing that's different with this function app is right here, your flux consumption location, right? That is what tells this CLI to create a flux consumption as opposed to a consumption or a premium app or what have you, right? And then once in there, we can run it locally like you normally would. But I wanted to show some other things here real quick, so the idea, like I said, we've got the virtual network integration, right? So again, really, really easy, right? Just again, run another AZ command. Here I'm actually running the Azure CLI instead of the function CLI, but basically saying, hey, add the VNet integration, to my Azure function, right? It's that simple. And you don't have to do this afterwards. You can do this when you create your Azure function, right? So, because most likely that you need that integration. So you can when you create your Azure function, so you can create that. Here's configuring the instance memory, and again, Right now, there's only two options, so 2048 and 4096. But again, very easy to change this, right? So, and it takes a moment for it. I mean, it's not instantaneous, but it's not more than a couple seconds either, right? I mean, it's pretty quick to change that memory setting, right? Here's your always ready. So in this example, and I didn't talk about this so much in the slides, but we also have some more settings here. I'm actually saying in this one, for my HTTP triggers in that function app, I want 10 always ready instances, right? So you have even more fine-grained control of this, right? Again, just I really love what they've done here, all right? And then you got your setting your concurrency limit. And again, very similar, right? And as I talked about on the slide, right, you do set this per your trigger type. So here I'm saying for my HTTP triggers, run, excuse me, 10 executions per instance, right? So real easy to do, not hard. But I talked about the always ready, right? I mean, I am really thinking about, for what I'm going to do for Jasper, because again, like I say, we are a one shift company. I'm thinking about, for some of our stuff, because some of it will potentially go to sleep during the day because there might be more than 20 minutes or so. So, I am thinking about running an automation job. So in the morning, turns on the always ready, make sure I get, execute, ready to run. In the evening, shut it down. So again, just save company even a little bit more money, right? Although as you saw, it's not a bad price. All right, so let me get back to my slides. All right, so we've been talking about all the great stuff. A couple things we do need to consider, and these really aren't that bad. It's so it's not there's a reason why I say considerations and not gotchas, right? But a couple things there are, right? So at this moment, again, it is in preview, right? Not all triggers are fully supported, and I purposely put yet, right? Because and again, I'm especially open on this one. So there are a couple unsupported triggers at this point. So the Kafka trigger is not supported, although I don't know anyone who's actually using the Kafka trigger. Not to say that it's not being used, but I am a little bit disappointed that the Azure SQL one's not there yet. But that being said, the Azure SQL it just got released, I think earlier this year that it went out. It went to GA, if I remember right. So not completely surprised because I mean it is still a newer trigger, but that is something we are using quite a bit. So that's when at the beginning I said we're not going to be using Flex Consumption right away. That's the biggest reason. I need to be able. I need that support. And then the single R is not supported right now. And then the quote unquote not fully supported is the blob trigger. So basically, blob triggers are not supported at this point. And again, I think it's coming. I don't know that for 100% sure. But what you can do is use the event grid source, which actually is what you should be doing anyways. The blob trigger. So the whole idea of the blob trigger is a blob gets added to, or an object gets created to your blob a container, and then you can have an Azure function, be triggered off that, maybe do an image resize, right? Create a thumbnail of it or what have you. The problem with the blob trigger itself is that it could take up to 10 minutes for it to execute because it does a polling, right? And that polling doesn't necessarily work as fast as you want it to work. So the event grid is really the way to do that anyways, right? So to me, that's not really, that big of a deal there. All right, some other considerations. So I mentioned not all regions are supported. Here is the list. I'm assuming this hasn't changed since last week. So actually here in the United States, we got pretty good coverage. All right, so East US, South Central, North Central, West, so we're pretty well covered. But we can see, in Europe it's a little bit less, in Asia it's a little bit less. Again, this makes sense, right? It's still in preview. They're still working out some kinks. So let Microsoft get it all fleshed out before they put it on all regions. That we would do the same thing if we were an application we would build, or hopefully we're doing the same thing. Our customers don't necessarily always let us do that, but they should. Couple other things. Your deployment options currently are limited. So right now you can't deploy via an Azure DevOps task or via, or really, I should say pipeline or GitHub action, right? And deployment slot. So in Azure Functions, you've got the whole idea of deployment slot. So basically, it's multiple copies of the Azure function, but at different stages. So you could, generally what we'll do with this is, I'll have my deployment slot, and so I'll produce the new, I'll produce the new version over there, push it over there, run some smoke test on it, and make sure it's doing what I want it to do, and then you actually can, do a swap, and it's a DNS swap, so it's again not instantaneous, but pretty darn quick. So that's not there yet, right? Like I say, I'm assuming we'll see that here, and I would assume before by the time we go to GA. I don't have any knowledge of that, but that would be my assumption. There are, some scale limitations. I already talked about this, again, the highest maximum, not really a limitation. That's a pretty good amount. Like I say, if you for some reason needed to not scale all the way up to 40, well, right now it's going to scale to 40, right? That, and then, like I said, it's in preview, right? So you've got limited support, right? So be cautious if I mean, it's really tempting to go ahead and move your stuff over here, and start using this, right, in production. But you do want to be a little bit cautious with that. And mostly because support, right? All right. So finally, one last section I've got in here, and that's decisions. So, we've been talking about flex consumption, but sure enough, we now have 5 mainline hosting options, right? And like I say, there's actually a couple others, but we've got 5 of the main ones we would talk about. How do you make the decision to use one over the other? Well, I was thinking about this, and here's what I came up with. And again, this isn't, this is my thoughts, right? If we look at the consumption model, right? So again, this is the idea. You're paying as you go. So it's that true serverless hosting, and you do get that automatic scaling, right? So you're getting all that, and the idea here is for the quote unquote sporadic workloads. And again, I say quote unquote because even in my example, that 3 million executions, I a lot of companies I work for, that's not really sporadic. That's a lot, right? But that's kind of what we're talking about. The idea that it's not running constantly throughout the day, right? It's or maybe, like in the Jasper situation, we don't run things at night, right? So, we've got a lot of times when it's not running, right? That's kind of what we're talking about here, right? But obviously where I don't need VNet or I don't need always ready, because those aren't in the consumption. And kind of alludes to flex consumption, right? Here, where I need that high scalability, right? I need the ability to scale it up quicker. I need, I want to better forecast my pricing because I'm declaring how much memory I'm using, right? So in the consumption model, you're charged based upon the memory you actually use, whereas the flex consumption, you're charged based upon the memory you're configured for, which is nice because it means, sure enough, technically it means I might pay for more memory than I'm actually using. Not really, honestly, you're not going to get ripped off on that. But it does mean that my bill is going to be more, more consistent month over month, assuming that my execution counts and my durations stay the same. So your use cases, and again, you need that more control over concurrency, right? Whether it be, one could be to get even better costing, right? Hey, 2048 is supposed to be able to run, what was it, 16 instances, or 16 concurrent executions, but I know I can hit even more, right? Because we're not using a whole lot of memory, right? For each, maybe it's a really small Azure functions. Or again, I need that VNet support, right? That's another big use. And again, why I am, at my current company. Again, I've only been at my current company for just over 6 months, right? So, and I've been excited about Azure Functions for much longer than that, but this is one of the big reasons why I'm really excited about it right now. Your premium, here again, you've got your pre-warm workers. I didn't talk about that much. So sure enough, Premium's got the idea that, again, it never scales down to zero. It scales down to at least one, and you specify how much, but it also has the idea of pre-warm. So it's, talking about the cold start, you actually have the ability to actually run things. So they're not fully running, right? But they're already warmed up. They've already got a bunch of the stuff loaded so that when they do get used, it's even quicker to get that started up, right? And again, connects to the virtual network. In today's, general availability services, this is what you need to do, or this is, one of the options if you need VNet. So here, again, to run multiple function apps in the same plan, that is a way of running this. Although I did find the one trick there. You could do that, but you can't have multiple Azure functions that need VNet connectivity. You can only have two, or at least what I ran into the other day. I can only have two function apps with VNet integration turned on within a app service plan. So you can run multiple function apps. You need that more compute power, right? Because again, there are more options here. There are more powerful offerings, especially compared to the consumption. And you need that VNet support. And even once Flex consumption goes into GA, for the high work use workloads, right? When I have near constant executions, all right? Premium eventually is going to be cheaper than Flex consumption, right? And that's part of the math you need to do, right? Is see, how many executions am I going to be running, right? All right. So the other one's the dedicated. So my general thought of the day, again, this is the idea that I'm running it on my own app service plan, and I'm, which means I control the scaling and all that type of stuff. I control the scaling through the tools that are built into the app service plan. But, you've got that responsibility. These are really for, one, I already have an app service plan that we're paying for, that we're not using it completely. That would be a use for this, right? Because again, save some money, right? I know this Azure function it's also not going to hold a lot of use. So hey, why not put in here where I'm paying for this? That's a use. Or another is where you have that long running scenario where durable functions can't be used. All right. I didn't talk much about durable functions because that really is a whole nother conversation. Basically, the easiest way to think about durable functions is, workflow orchestrations that are done via Azure Functions, right? But so that's the idea of using dedicated. There are some other reasons for this. So the first time I gave this presentation a week and a half ago, it was to a bunch of people at Humana, and that's actually what they're doing mostly. They're actually looking to change that, but when they originally created, they needed that extra security that they got with the ASEs, right? Which is still a dedicated model. And so that's exactly what they were doing. And then finally, you got your container apps. Again, I have to admit, I have not done a container app function app. But my feelings on this, one, if I'm mixing with other container apps, right? Again, it keeps, if my developers are working a bunch of container apps, it might make sense to use this type of functionality because they're more used to it. Or I want to use Dapper support, because you've got that capability in there. The other thing, I was really thinking about this. Another good possibility is, you're migrating on-prem stuff, or your legacy apps to the cloud. Well, it's going to be, potentially it's a lot easier to get that into a container and then upload that into a container app and have it triggered off of an Azure function trigger, right? So, that's kind of things you can think of. So, in summary, right? I mean, we've been talking about serverless and Azure functions, but in particular, this new flex consumption. If you can't tell, I'm really, really excited. I'm been really stoked to be using this. Lots of amazing features that we've got in here. Again, and I'm not sure if Paul's still on here. I'm not saying this because, so sure enough, the reason why I keep on mentioning Paul is actually on the Azure, or one of the things he does is with.
And I am here, by the way. I've been enjoying this.
Okay. So I'm not saying my love of Azure Functions just because Paul's on here. I really am so excited about this feature. So it's not just lip service. It's really You know, this is exciting times, and I'm really glad to see this. So with that, I've been rambling. I don't even know how long I've been rambling, but we have any questions? Oh, I also noticed we also have Tiago. So I'm actually using Tiago's sample code, and Tiago is actually one of the ones who actually works on a lot of this code. So that's pretty cool to see he's in here too. All right, well, awesome. So with that, Sean,
Yes, thank you, Chad. That was awesome. It's great to see you reusing some of that and adding to it, which was amazing to see. Thank you.
You're going deeper and finding all the edges, which I think is
Yeah.
awesome. That's
Great.
Well,
exactly.
one, thank you so much for having that sample code up there, because that made my life a whole lot easier to build the presentation.
Cool.
All right, Sean, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you, Chad. I greatly appreciate it. Yeah, there was quite a bit of discussion in there, and Chad, I'll leave it. I'm
Yeah,
gonna
like I said,
give you
I
a
did
copy of
not
the
see
chat afterwards, because there's some really great comments and questions going on, and Paul and Diego covered quite a few of the questions as well. So that's great. Thank you, Paul and Diego, as well, for helping out in chat and covering some questions. And it's great to have the actual team members that are developing this and to help cover a couple of outlining questions, things like that maybe Chad didn't know, or maybe I didn't know, or whatever. And so it's really great. And I know I had a couple of questions in there as well. So anyway, Chad, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate it. I'm going to still back host right quick. All right. So go ahead and leave your screen up for just a bit if you want. Oh, never mind. That's okay. Thank you all for coming out tonight. You're more than welcome to stick around. We're going to have some after hours talk. So you're more than welcome to stick around, have a drink if you'd like, whatever. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and we'll see you at the next event.